kindly request the participant group presenters to take their seats back in the audience. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to invite the rest of the expertise panel to come to the stage. That is Rear Admiral D.C. Gunawardena from Sri Lanka Navy, Dr. Derek Yuan, Ms. Jeewanthi Senanayake, Assistant Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, Air Commodore Sagara Kottakatheniya from Sri Lanka Air Force, Professor Ram Manikalingam, Major General P.L. Wickramaratne, the Commander Security Forces Headquarters Central, Professor Ashadu Saman, Dr. Christopher Ankerson, Professor Adrian Kendry, Dr. Harinder Vidanage, the Director, Bandanagara Center for International Studies, and Professor Matthew Warren, the Professor of Information Systems at Deakin University, Australia. Please come on stage, please, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have been witnessing presentations submitted by the 4 study groups on given topics. I thank all those 4 groups for their remarkable contribution. And with that, I cordially invite the chair and the rest of the panelists to commence their expertise comments on group presentation and to mark the formal closure of the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. What I propose doing here is we have a panel of experts, 12 of us on this table here. We've all heard the 4 presentations, and what I would like here is to have each of you share your observations, and perhaps if you have any questions, to direct them to the particular group's presentations, and let's hear more from them. So shall we start from the left? We'll start with the lady.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to share a few comments about the presentation that Group 1 did. And also before that, I would like to highlight a few salient points that we discussed in the group as important for this topic. The first one that we all agreed upon was that the importance of having soft power in terms of achieving national interests. This goes the same for developing as well as developed countries. And also the importance of focusing on preventing versus cure. it's prevention where the soft power comes in handy. And then everybody mainly talked about having win-win situations, ideally. We discussed about that as well, but we kind of came to an agreement, understanding that in this realistic world, it might be difficult to achieve completely 100% win-win situations. So those are some of the key points that we focused on, in addition to all the points that were covered upon in the presentation. So in my comments, I would like to highlight first one thing that came under prerequisites, that's strategic clarity that the presentation talked about. Under that, the presenter explained mutually beneficial policies and also transparency and well-articulated intent as requirements for having strategic clarity. Again, I would comment that if we take soft power as Joseph Nye explained it, theoretically, yes, then you have all this. You have strategic clarity in terms of mutually beneficial policies and also transparency and a well-articulated intent. But the world is not ideal, it's more realist. In this realistic world, in the realistic point of view, these two do not work as they are depicted in theory. So we should not forget that there is, although we talk about soft power, there is a hard side to the soft power as well, as we experience daily in the world. So in reality, in defense training and education, when we talk about it, when we try to have it aiming at achieving enhancing soft policy of a country to achieve the country's national interests, we have to be mindful to exert our own soft power, especially when we are at the receiving end. Because as I said earlier, the concept of soft power, when it comes to defense, education and training, we always tend to focus on the giving end more and less on the receiving end. So we talk about strategic interests of the giving end, the donor country. But there are strategic interests, national interests of the receiving country as well. The point here is the receiving country also has to be mindful to achieve her own national interests in terms of getting these defense cooperation, defense training and education, and of course, this training and exercises, this training and cooperation given with all good intention, but then when you're at the receiving end, you have to be mindful to exercise your own soft power as well to project what is beneficial for you. And then there's another point that I want to make in addition to that. When we talk about defense training and education, we mainly tend to talk about military training and education. Defense consists of the military component as well as the civilian component. So we talked about this in the group also, but then we came to an agreement that we would present the military component, but I would like to talk a little bit about what is relevant for the civilian component as well, because when it comes to defense administration of a country, civilians largely get involved. And through training and education, if one party is able to realign the thinking of that defense administration in terms of getting it more aligned with the strategic interests of some external party, let's say, then that external party has a great leeway of penetrating into internal security and internal defense related matters of that country. And that's a big say that the country, that external party can have. So when we talk about defense administration and education, we have to keep in mind the defense administration and the civilian component as well. That's it from me. Thank you very much. I think my other panelists would like to add their comments.
Good afternoon. First of all, I have to admit that I could be the least qualified so-called expert to comment on these presentation because I received no military education and have no military experience. But it is an eye-opening experience for me to understand that actually the military or the military personnel sometimes tend to have quite an idealistic view on soft power. They think soft power sometimes may mean win-win cooperation, which is kind of a rarity in international politics and in many situations. So this tendency to romanticize or idealize soft power could be dangerous because first of all, they may not, in the very first place, they are not very familiar with the concept itself. But then they may seek to achieve some not so achievable ends, that is cooperation or even some win-win situation. So my suggestion is maybe it is easier for military personnel to first understand smart power or the mixture of soft and smart power. So that will allow them for that transitional period. And also in my group, it seems there's at least one of them is mentioning the colonial dimension or the post-colonial dimension of defense training and education and enhancing soft power. I believe, since to me, given my very limited knowledge on the subject, that soft power sometimes is not as benevolent as it seems. So, and it may not mean that much to smaller or middle power, and even it would be, it can go counterproductive to some smaller powers or some post-colonial countries. So I suggest that seeing defense training education, in accordance with soft power, we should have a special focus on looking at how it works, for a smaller and middle power, how enhancing soft power would promote the national interest, but without being just a follower of greater powers or larger countries. Same does the putting the colonial or post-colonial dimension to the studies, because to some maybe African countries, this is something they have to touch upon, and I think this is worth investigating. In other groups' presentation, I find many of them are mentioning things such as values or culture. As a civilian, I know this may be more of my field, but I understand that could be difficulties for military personnel to embrace these two concepts. But it is good to know, at least after coming to this seminar, that military exchange is actually very active and frequent amongst different countries. And the cultural side can be solved pretty easily. But for the values, while it comes to soft power, then it will really need to be fully understood by the military personnel what the real policy is, of the home country, and this would be a little tough. But as I have studied a little bit of counterinsurgency theory, I find some of the elements in the counterinsurgency theories are quite applicable in the 21st century environment, that you have to win the hearts and mind, you have to make sure politically that they're satisfied and make full use of soft power. So I'm afraid these are my observations so far. Thank you.
Deliberated much on points which are very pertinent to this era. As my other panel member told, there were 3 other points which I noted down. We had a deliberation because the countries, there were representatives from countries who were suffering from terrorism right now, and whether soft power can be used against that scenario where there is terrorism going on, and whether it is limited, exertion of soft power is limited only to big countries, and whether all levels of military could exert soft power or it is only the hierarchy. So Brigadier Kashif was a representative of our group who gave the presentation. I think it was quite thought-provoking and comprehensive. He gave a lot of insights on power, referring to Hans Mugantu's different facets, and also he went on to explain military power and changing notion of security and multi-phase threats which demands a projection of soft power in the 21st century. Shades of military soft power, of course, was deliberated by other speakers as well. And as we know, the defense attaches, there were a lot of defense attaches in our group also. So they have a big role to play, and they are the best tool to exert soft power by a country. As Vijayanti told, Brigadier Kashif elaborately explained the win-win situation, explaining by a case study, and also the prerequisites, and finally the domestic projection of soft power, where he took Sri Lanka case as a model, and also went on to say where other countries in the world have also, it's good to take Sri Lankan model as a, as an example, and even that they have taken it as an example, Pakistan themselves, and proved it to be true. So that is as far as the rehabilitation, spiritual, religious, education, sports, etc. So finally I could say that Brigadier Kashif has done justice to Group A by giving a good presentation for the limited time given. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Group B, very dynamic group, presented their paper on vitality of soft power for security and prosperity in the 21st century. Colonel Allard presented the paper, and it was an interesting analysis of emerging force driving international geopolitics in this century. Group emphasized the fact that there are many challenges and opportunities encountered when employing soft power. They elaborated on that, which has to be exploited in a complex situations. During the preparation stage, the very positive and very good response from the all participants. One other thing they emphasized was the globalization. Soft power is frequently related to trends in globalization. Even though soft power may not produce results at the same speed as hard power, it is much less expensive than hard power. Powerful, developed countries protect their territorial integrity and national sovereignty through military power. But it is evident that the war against terror did not achieve the final objective through hard power. And it is increasingly evident that it cannot be won without winning the hearts and minds of people. So one other thing, the elaborated on the political stability for security and prosperity on the 21st century. The developed countries enjoy political stability, economic prosperity, and consolidate their powerful image through economic ties. In addition to that, soft power has been used as a tool to project potential and capabilities in terms of culture, religion, economy, and politics to implement foreign policy. So my other two colleagues, Dr. Ram and Professor Tekwani, will you add something to the topic?
Sure, we will.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I will just comment on the overall presentations that I heard, since you've covered quite a bit, Vice Marshal, and look at two points that were raised during the presentations that I think were interesting. One is that the Colonel from the UK raised the issue of the use of digital media by IS and contrasted it with traditional military use of it. So IS organizes its operations around the media image that it would project, while militaries use the digital media, social media, to describe, explain, justify their operations. I think this is an important point, and I think more importantly, IS also uses that as a recruitment tool. So they have smartly identified social media as a means of recruiting. And the barriers to recruitment in IS are very, very low, while the ability to exercise command and control is quite high. This is an interesting paradox within IS. At the same time, I want to talk about the limits of social media and the virtual world in terms of soft power, because at the end of the day, while IS may recruit this way, carry out operations to maximize publicity, IS's aim is to develop and control a territory, because whatever successors we may have in the social media, we are still limited in the way we exercise political sovereignty today territorially. So even IS, with all of its sophistication in media, wants to control a plot of land and wants to exercise and build its caliphate on that plot of land. So I say this just to say that we need to keep in mind, I think the first speaker also raised this, the limits of what we would call soft power, and that that control of land is also very important to IS. So just to balance between the two. The second point I want to make, and this came up in the course of our discussion, again, I forget her name, but there was a young lady participant who said that, look, in all stages of conflict, whether it is pre-conflict, whether it is the actual conflict and post-conflict, we will be using both forms of power. Soft power and hard power will both be exercised. And it is interesting and useful for us to think a little bit more about how we combine those two things in different stages, pre-conflict, post-conflict, conflict and post-conflict. One of the points colleagues from Nigeria raised, the brigadier in charge of planning there, Brigadier Godwin, mentioned that Boko Haram was operating in terms of its extremism as an ideological, political entity, well, not political, but social entity, and then it suddenly transformed itself into a militant entity. It was so sudden that it took Nigeria by surprise. And so the question I think that is worth all of us asking here is, when does that transformation take place? Is the social media allow it to happen so quickly? What is the role of social media? What is the role of security forces, intelligence in understanding this shift, this transformation? It was raised again in our group by Lady Olga Maitland, who queried my point that extremism is different from violent extremism, and said, look, in many countries there is recruitment taking place through extremist preaching, extremist proselytizing. And I think the interesting question to ask is, what is that borderline between nonviolent extremism and violent extremism, and can that be specified, and can we understand it better in terms of both social media and practically? Finally, I think another participant in our group, Sri Lankan General, I apologize, sir, for not remembering your name. It was up on the board. He talked about the potential for a race of soft power, like you have a race, economic race, political race, military race, that I think from Derek's presentation this morning, we heard about how China, Korea, Japan are competing for soft power. And the question I would put to us, is there a point at which this race can actually, somebody might say, well, forget it, I'm not going to fight with you on your terms, I'm going to use hard power to win this race. So is there a way in which soft power can actually lead to and exacerbate conflict if it becomes a race and competition between different states, entities, agencies for power, and at what point does such a race become problematic? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chief of Defence Staff, Commander of the Sri Lanka Army, distinguished delegates and guests, all participants from the friendly countries, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I thought, being a member of the hosting organization Sri Lanka Army, that I need to come on stage to the podium and talk to you for a while, taking about 10 minutes, representing the Group C. And I thought it was once again the exercising of soft power, where the whole expertise panel of Group C co-opted for me to come to the podium and to speak a few words on behalf of the expertise panels. And also taking into consideration the fact that both the other expert panelists in the Group C have already come on stage and spoken to you before. Now I would like to begin my talk with a famous quote by Joseph Nye. I quote, "Security is like oxygen. You tend not to notice it until you lose it." I unquote. So the armed forces, no doubt, give oxygen to any nation. Traditional use of military force is hard power. However, the reality is that militaries around the world have been exercising soft power in pursuit of national interests for many years. The traditional use of and acceptability of hard power among Western democracies, particularly in Europe, is increasingly being challenged. Now, this has brought reluctance by some nations to deploy troops to theaters around the world as hard power instruments. The use of military in soft power mode to support the national interest is now seen as less contentious and more legitimate. Now, military force is not under the threat of obsolescence because of the availability of smart power and soft power alternatives. But its utility to liberal Western societies is menaced by the imprudent measure of their imprudent enthusiasm for placing constraints upon their use of it. Of course, military force should be used only as necessary and in the quantity suitable to its task. Now, military capability is not only an important component of national hard power, but also an important means to enhance international status and shape national soft power. Armed forces can play a vital role in creating soft power in the current global context. On the one hand, armed forces deployment in peacekeeping missions can help building peaceful images of a country through disseminating knowledge about its culture. And the potential using of its armed forces could be more rewarding and less costly than rearming. The provision of humanitarian assistance is another way to express solidarity and project soft power. Now, humanitarian aid can be provided not only through the societal actors using economic resources, but also by armed forces using military resources. Now, it is apparent that one of the major motives behind the engagement of some major states in UN peacekeeping operations and in mediating peace negotiation is to cultivate their country's image as a responsible, peace-loving, and generous member of the international community. During the responses of armed forces from countries around the world, to address environmental calamities and catastrophes like the cyclone Nagis in Myanmar, tsunami in Indonesia, cyclone Sidr in Bangladesh, earthquakes in Pakistan, China, and Nepal, where the affected nations received massive humanitarian aid for many countries, could be cited as few examples. Now, military alliances present a conspicuous example of power outsourcing. Also, the relief operations provided by the US Navy after 2004 tsunami in Indonesia and in other affected countries helped improve the image of United States, an image that suffered large damages in the military deployment in Iraq the previous year in 2003. Another example is the interest of China's participation in UN peacekeeping mission operations, which is mainly focused on setting up an image of being a responsible power, enhancing the Army's combat capacity, building a harmonious world, boosting bilateral relations with the host country, ensuring energy supply, promoting exchanges with foreign armies, and improving capability of governance, global governance. So it is seen as an effective tool of developing soft power of the militaries around the world. Of course, giving help in bad times is definitely soft power. Now, traditionally, hard power was seen as the domain of the armed forces, yet the challenges of the 21st century require a balance of both hard power and soft power for successful strategic engagement in the national interest. The armed forces are called to act in many different threat scenarios today, ranging from environment to economic and heritage protection, which have not only national but international implications as well. In the global arena, climate change is seen as a critical priority issue where the armed forces have come to play an important role in early warning, disaster response, mitigation, and relief. In international peacekeeping operations, armed forces deployment have to be sensitive to the power of attraction through, for example, capabilities and behavior in order to build a positive image of the culture of the sending country and also to enhance the reputation of the United Nations and its capacity to promote sustainable development and peace. So what are the tools of military soft power? I think this was amply covered by Colonel from Canada, and therefore I shall skip this part. Now, I am of the opinion that the core of soft power is culture, and further it is mainly represented by the core of culture, that is value. And no doubt, core values of the military continues immensely in enhancing soft power. Now, Sri Lanka Army has articulated its values, taking into consideration this national values, constitution of the Sri Lanka Army, and the vision of the Sri Lanka Army, national and military symbols, insignia, motto, historical background and military history, regimentation, arts, craft, songs and poetry. And loyalty, integrity, respect, honor, selflessness and personal courage are the main values of the Sri Lanka Army, which shapes it to maintain high dignity in the face of destructive criticism and build image of our nation. So armed forces around the world which upholds core values is certain to march towards professionalism, brilliance and enhancing soft power. Now, I would also like to touch upon briefly on the Sri Lankan armed forces contribution during the post-conflict scenario in undertaking civic tasks. Defining rehabilitation of over 12,000 ex-combatants, resettlement over 300,000 internally displaced persons, constructing a large number of houses for them, infrastructure development, and of the newly resettled areas. Now, this was the unique 5R system we adopted in the country during the post-conflict scenario: reconstruction, resettlement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and reconciliation. Now, war involves application of military force, which means violence that causes damage, injury, death, chaos, and friction. That is in the very nature of warfare. Now, military forces in the 21st century have proven that they can adapt to the present conflicts. With that, gentlemen, I conclude my little comments, and I thank the panel for cooperating with me. Thank you.
But do you have any comments to make? Any observations? No. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. The only comment that I would say, because we've had quite a comprehensive briefing by the general, is that we talked a little bit about the abilities of militaries to do soft power, to both use soft power in their approach and also to generate soft power for the future use by themselves and for the country at large. But we started to discuss and didn't get very far down the road, but I think it was an important beginning of a conversation to wonder if armed forces should be the only instrument in an arsenal that are looking at soft power. Oftentimes they find themselves in a position where they have no choice, but I think it's a matter of national policy, how quickly other forms and other instruments of soft power are brought to bear. And I think that was an interesting conversation that I'd like to have continued. Thank you.
General De Silva, distinguished members of the Sri Lankan Army and other government representatives and defense advisors from many countries, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen from all over the world. First of all, I would like to add to what Major General Greg Bilton said this morning about the outstanding hospitality and generosity and quality of the program that has been provided for this Colombian Defense Seminar 2016. It will live long in my memory, and the thing that will probably live most long in my memory is the sheer importance of musical soft power. I have been a great advocate of musical soft power during my time at NATO headquarters. A couple of the Secretary Generals said to me, if you can sing Our Way to Peace, then you should do some more singing. It might be your most important task. And I remember once in a very tense seminar in Tbilisi in Georgia, when there was a potential for conflict breaking out at the seminar between representatives of Azerbaijan and Armenia, that in the end, with the British ambassador at a reception, we did some singing, which persuaded not only the Georgians and the Armenians to also join in with musical celebration. But the next day, the discussions about the Black Sea and cooperation in that region took on a wholly new positive dimension. That's not to say that the challenges between Armenia and Azerbaijan have been solved. Many of you will know that that still remains a big matter of importance. I have two distinguished colleagues next to me, Dr. Harendra and Professor Matthew. So I'm going to confine my comments about what you heard earlier just to a few important points. The group that we had was incredibly dynamic and animated and had many, many different thoughts and ideas which we could spend many hours examining. But let me just take some points which I think are worth reflecting upon, and then I would just wrap that up with a few observations about what was said in the seminar and what Brigadier Mahmood, Brigadier General Mahmood and Colonel Peter spoke to you about earlier. I mean, the first thing to say is that this digital era and soft power really represents a discontinuous change. Discontinuity in the digital environment is happening so rapidly and with such bewildering implications. It's bringing new trends in the speed of communication and our global reach, as our distinguished earlier panelists said. Secondly, that we should be aware of the implications for our populations in terms of their demography. Older people struggle, and that's true in the military as in with the civilian sectors, with coming to terms with what all of this means in terms of the digital era and soft power. But you know, let's be honest about this, unless you are under the age of 24, you probably don't understand that very much about exactly what is really happening in this transformation. At least my 4 sons, who are now age 30 and over, tell me that they are now out of touch. And it's only my 4-year-old granddaughter who can really explain to me what is happening in the world of digital exchange. The possibility, therefore, that young people who are economically challenged, deprived, maybe not able to take part in this exchange, this is a really serious issue for soft power, because if we're dealing with segments of our populations where it's very difficult to filter out what is important and what is not important. Anybody who surfs the net will know that the vast amount of trivial information, which is of no consequence, to try to discern what is really important, that is a big challenge. So finally, let me just say, in my role as an economist, from my experiences with NATO and subsequently, there is a book that Jeremy Rifkin published in 2014 and came out in paperback 2015 called The Zero Marginal Cost Society, the Internet of Things and the Collaborative Commons. And this book describes how soft power is being translated into a network-based smart economy. And so in this seminar discussion earlier, in our group discussion, we thought about the role of drones, we thought about the role of the Uber taxi services. We thought about the role of the Airbnb, introducing a wholly new concept to how economies and services work. Secondly, if we're thinking about soft power in terms of the democratization of soft power in an economic landscape and the implications for local empowerment, all of this is really vital for those in the military who are thinking about how their engagement with soft power is going to change in the coming decade, because we need to be aware of what kind of implications and absorption of the digital era is really being taken up by the societies that we are working with. In the seminar, in the discussion, in the group discussion, one of my colleagues from Colonel from the Maldives talked about the challenge of the virtual world transcending the physical world, and we have some really serious problems. And my penultimate point is that if we're thinking about public and private cooperation from the point of view of military engagement with soft power, then that will bring out huge challenges, as I know that Dr. Harendra will probably elaborate upon that. And my final thought is this: we've been using the phrase thinking outside the box. It's not so much thinking outside the box, it's thinking almost outside the universe. The scale of change is so staggering and so rapid that we are all going to have to examine the ways in which we communicate, we interact. This is where alliances and where partnerships are of crucial importance in coming to terms with how soft power is affected by the digital era. And let me pass over to Dr. Harendra.
Thank you, Professor Kendry. Mr. Veerakoon, Permanent Secretary to the Foreign Affairs Ministry, General De Silva, all distinguished guests. So, as Professor Kendry pointed out, we had this very stimulating session on digital media and the whole idea of soft power in the digital age. So actually what we discussed was rather cyber age than the digital age. So I think there were comments made earlier as well by Professor Manikalingam. And so what I want to focus on is three things. The first one is what both Brigadier Mahmood and Colonel Peter pointed out, the idea of adaptation. How can security forces, military institutions adapt in this extremely fluid environment where social media is generating so much of information, so much of narratives, so much of creating knowledge. So what I would argue is that rather than adaptation, we have to think of a full-scale evolution. How can military institutions evolve to understand, engage, and actually, in a way, it's a reinventing of military communication strategies in the 21st century. When you look at the way Daesh, Al-Qaeda, or even far-right groups are making on the internet and on cyberspace. The message is quite similar. Maybe the institutions are quite different, the groups are different, but the way they kind of bring out that message, it is challenging established institutions like militaries to evolve. Because political communication is at the core of all security establishments, and political communication is also the key weapon of many adversaries and terror organizations. So in that context, I want to move on to the idea of soft power. I mean, there have been a lot of conversation here. The fact is that the misconception is that we are talking as if soft power is a kind of a fixed thing. We think it as a kind of a linear force, and that's where we kind of have to make the differentiation. When you juxtapose soft power with hard power, a country, a nation that can increase its military or hard power progressively in a linear progression can be named as a serious hard power, serious superpower. But the problem is such nations cannot sustain its soft power projections the same way they do it with their hard power projections. The classic example would be the Kunduz incident last year in Afghanistan, right? And where Médecins Sans Frontières Iran hospital was hit by a C-130U gunship of the US military. And immediately, the narrative of the US military was challenged by Médecins Sans Frontières one tweet. And it kind of really challenged that established hard power. So in that context, as our presenters did in the group, we have to rethink of not just adaptation. We have adapted, but I think what the digital age has done is shown us the limit of adaptability, right? It's like, finally the US Army giving away the Humvee for the posh Oshkosh vehicle. So moving on to the second point. The second point has been always about speed. Everybody mentioned speed. It's fast, okay? And it is an important point here. A lot of us don't think of it like this. The modern nation state was created to stop the speed of the nomads, right? The first real warriors, Genghis Khan's nomads, they were the first cyber warriors because Genghis Khan used information warfare in his, as a part of his war machine. That was stopped by the establishment of the sedentary state. So the state and its militaries are the bulwark against the speed. But what cyber is doing is actually undoing that establishment. Now the speed is back with adversaries who are actually not as powerful as Genghis Khan, but they have the speed to take on the state, right? The state messages, the state narrative, the knowledge, the understanding, the norms the state creates are being challenged by the adversaries who has the speed. That's where cyber comes in also. Thirdly, how does the state react to all of these things? You are the state, and you are your states. So if you look at the last few years, the way cyber responses of states is increasing militarization of state responses. Every state is spending on weaponization of cyberspace. There are only 9 nuclear-powered nations, but there are 26 nations which have cyber offensive capabilities. But what we forget in that process is when the state adapts cyber militarization, the state forgoes its ability to project soft power. More you militarize cyberspace, more you forgo your ability to project soft power. Because it's antithetical. That gives space to adversaries like the Daesh to come out with their message, and also adversaries like, for a state, WikiLeaks is an adversary. It's creating opposition. One person, Snowden can be adversary, WikiLeaks can be adversary. But it's a result of states focusing more on weaponization of cyberspace rather than doing otherwise, right? So I think what I'm going to end by saying is we are living in a time when we need compelling national narratives. Like global transformations are disrupting so many things, Uber and all these things, but beyond that, xenophobia, right-wing radicalism, Islamic fundamentalism, everything is undoing the very essence of what we have established as states. So cyberspace is being used as a tool, a weapon, and a space to stage those offenses. So that's something I think we should take away, and that's what I think our group members were trying to say, but what I just did was put that into context. I think this is what all of them said. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo Professor Kendry's thanks to General De Silva and the conference organisers. It's been a wonderful event, and I've absolutely enjoyed my time here in Sri Lanka. So thank you so much for the experience. The group was very interesting because it really sort of put into context from a defence perspective many of the issues that we'd thought of as academics. One of the issues that came out from yesterday was the concept of cricket as soft power, and I was thinking to myself, well, Sri Lanka has certainly taught Australia a lesson when it comes to soft power, as well as teaching us a lesson in cricket. In terms of our group, really what we're focusing upon was the fact that soft power in the digital age is about information, and that, in essence, is what soft power is. So the group did sort of reflect upon the importance of cybersecurity to try to protect that information. We did reflect a little bit about some of the positivities of soft power in the digital age in terms of e-government and e-diplomacy, and the fact that government entities can reach out, to citizens across the world or citizens within a country to share information, to get exchange on ideas. We also then touched upon defense organizations themselves had social media presence. We touched upon country examples. The Australian Defence Force has extensive social media strategies that covers, all aspects of the Defence Force. But one of the themes that really came out was, in terms of social media, is the amount of information that's generated and the speed at which that information is generated. So really, when you're talking about soft power in a digital age, you're actually talking about a real-time exchange of information. And it was touched upon the difficulties that gives to defense organizations, intelligence organizations, to react to that information in real time, to be able to extract key information from the rubbish that's being generated. Again, that takes a lot of tools. Yes, garbage in, garbage out. As was mentioned before, we touched upon new threat agents that appear in the digital age, whether that's WikiLeaks, Anonymous, the Syrian Electronic Army, Guardians of Peace acting on behalf of the North Korean government. And I was struck by an example from one of the UK representatives who discussed the aspect, the power of ISIS, that ISIS has the power to overcome security policies and strategies an organization may have and reach out directly to a young person in London radicalize that young person and convince that young person to carry out a lone wolf terrorist attack. That's a very strong message because it means, in terms of policy development and strategy that's been developed, it can be bypassed by unique one-on-one conversations. So again, that's something that sort of struck me, was the power that terrorist organizations can have in this age. We also then touched upon the training needs regarding the use of social media and some of the ethical considerations. And as was touched upon before, the fact that within defense organizations, it's actually your younger members of your defense organization who have the expertise about social media. And it would be the older members of your defense organizations that are more likely not to have the expertise. So there's a possible exchange there that also raises issue, because it's also going to be the younger members of your defense organizations that are going to be posting about operational issues on Facebook, taking selfies, putting it on their Twitter account. So it raises, in terms of a human capital, within each of your defense forces, you have a strong human capital around social media and digital power with your younger members of your defense forces, because they truly understand the technology. There's then some ethical issues, training issues about the use of those technologies that have to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I thank the panel very much for their observations. And if I may, before I turn over the floor to the audience for any questions or comments you may have, if I may, I would like to add a couple of comments myself. First, I believe all of us here would agree that our groups that we were in were very robust. They had robust discussions, debates, and I can vouch for Group B at least. We spent the first 45 minutes in trying to identify the exact question that we should be looking at. So it was very stimulating. I would suggest that we give all the groups a big hand. I mean, they did a tremendous job. I think it's phenomenal that in the given time, they were able to come up with some good observations here. Having said that, I have a couple of observations to make, and I'm going to speak purely from the perspective of media and terrorism. We often hear that publicity is the oxygen of terrorism. That's one of the things we often hear. And going by most of the discussions that I've been hearing off and on mic, it appears to me that we're probably crediting social media with too much importance in terms of being the sole cause of all the bad and evil that's befalling all around us. We have to remind ourselves often, whether it's social media or mainstream media, none of these media work in a vacuum. None of them work in a vacuum. You can spend all the $1 million and $1 billion you have on projecting your soft power and messaging to your own audiences and overseas, but as long as your systems of governance are somewhat ineffective, you're not going to be able to combat the problem. And there certainly are groups that are disaffected. There are people who feel discriminated, people who feel marginalized, people who fear insecurity. Now, whether this is real or perceived, it exists. So whatever your messaging and soft power projection might be, unless these issues are addressed, no amount of soft power and messaging is going to help us out on this one. Now, having said that, I actually had a question for Group 3. I believe there was a slide in which they were speaking of countering terrorism, and there was a little bubble which said we got to reinstate a democracy. My question, or something to think about, would be whose democracy? What kind of democracy are we talking about here? I believe in some regions the word democracy has different meanings than we think it does, just as much as the word terrorism has different meanings in different parts of the world. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll open it to the floor for comments and questions. Please.
Sorry for...
Well, I got you to speak at last.
I had an epiphany of sorts, not on of the kind they had on the road to Damascus, but still an epiphany. Just one thing, when we talk about smart power, listening to all the discussions which we have been having over the past 2 days, it seems that the onus is on the armed forces to practice soft power. But I think this is something which came up in our discussion today, and I thought that I would share this with you. At the end of the day, Clausewitz matters. The reason for that, again, is very simple. He pointed out to us long ago that the military is an instrument in the hand of politicians, and the politicians should know what they want to do with the military, and vice versa. The military should also tell the political masters what can be and what cannot be achieved with the military. And that is why Clausewitz did point out that there should be a military officer sitting in the cabinet, even though it was later on turned into something very different. Now, the reason why I bring this up is to share with all of you the concern that are we asking the military to do too much? Are we getting moved by the concept of smart power in such a manner that we tend to forget that the military is a somewhat different instrument? And of course, what is also very important is we do remember that whatever the political masters will ask the armed forces across different parts of the world, the military has to, or the armed forces, they have to deliver that. So I think we also need to think about how soft power is being perceived by society, how soft power is perceived by our political masters, and only then can we say that yes, armed forces and soft power, they can be a match made in heaven or maybe a marriage made in hell in the days ahead. So thank you. I thought I'd share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the floor is open for any observations or questions any of you might have of the particular groups or of anybody.
Yeah, I'm General Bonigaspaya from Sri Lanka Army. Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, they have both agreed you have to prove it by action, not by argument. I think Commander of the Sri Lanka Army, General Kishan De Silva, with the blessing of Secretary of Defense, it has been proved by action for successfully organizing Colombo Defense Seminar 2016. My congratulations goes to them. I wish to share some of my thoughts about soft power. The building we all are seated is called BMICH, Bandaranaike Memorial International Conference Hall, gifted by China to the government of Sri Lanka. I think this is a classic example of soft power. And also another building, Nelum Pokuna, or art gallery, is also another example of soft power. They have entered into Africa, where there are 54 countries. I think most of the countries have been touched by them, slowly but surely, in terms of soft power. They can do that. By 2010, they had 4,000 billion US dollars as foreign reserve. Nobody can say these things are bad. These things are good. We are benefited even today for having their soft power in Sri Lanka. In the same way, Sri Lanka Army is now deployed in the north and east, doing very good things, doing roads, making culverts, restoring electricity, also building tanks and waterways, and helping livelihood. But some criticize. But it is nothing but application of soft power. I do want to ask a very simple question. Sri Lanka military deployment in the north, doing good things, helping people, applying soft power, is it a bad thing? Thank you very much.
I don't think anybody agrees that it's a bad thing. I think everybody thinks it's a great thing. Unless somebody wants to challenge that here. No?
Well, if I can comment on this, I think you've raised a very good point. I was in Jaffna about a month ago at a meeting organized by a Jaffna commander where he invited the brigade commanders to discuss their thinking. And they're doing a lot of the work you mentioned, General, and it was impressive to hear it. At the same time, I think we all recognize that it is not the military's job to continue to do building, engineering, provide medical services and electricity and health services. That is the job of the government, Ministry of Health, the Road Development Authority, and so on. So I think the challenge, the way I see it, is that when you have urgent problems to solve immediately, and in a context where the military is the only agency that has the capacity, we must go to them and get their help. At the same time, in the long term, we all recognize that the military must exit from these areas, and these areas must be dealt with by the civilian authorities. So you feel this dilemma where to do something immediately, one must go to the military because it is the only force with the capacity in the north and east. But at the same time, in the long term, if you want to build capacity in the north and east, then the military will have to quietly withdraw from it. So how do we balance between urgent needs and addressing it immediately and dealing and going to the military for that, and at the same time building long-term capacity? So it's not whether it's a good or bad thing, it is definitely a good thing in the short term, but even the military would agree they don't want to be building roads and doing health services and clinics and handling, they want to do what they do as a military, train and protect the country and the nation. So I think this is the dilemma we are facing, and I think when people raise these criticisms, some people I think raise it for political reasons, that's a different question, but when that's raised in a more practical way of how to engage and move forward, I think the point you raised, this is my response to that. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to add something onto this. I think the point that General Boniface Pereira raised is a classic example where we use military soft power as a confidence-building measure. Because when we talk about using soft power, military, we talk about its internal and external dimensions both. When it comes to the external dimension, we focus on having bilateral and multilateral cooperation, focusing on projecting our national interests in other regions of the world. When it comes to the internal dimension, we focus on our own people and we exercise our soft power for the benefit of our own people, and this is a classic example.
Thank you. So,
Shyam?
Me to clarify a few points which were raised by General Boniface Pereira and the responses that came from the expert panel. The government machinery is fully active in the north and east. It's in full control. Let me assure you, like in other countries, the military will take instructions from its political authority and assist whenever they are requested to assist. I like to draw a few parallels on this. Now, when there are a number of issues as a result of tsunami and various other natural calamities, including floods, not only in Sri Lanka but across the world, the first to respond was the military. That is because they are trained and they are equipped to operate in areas where the other agencies may perhaps not have the capacity or capability to operate. At the same time, depending on the location also, it's the military which could respond instantly to a situation like that. So I just want to make one point clear. In Sri Lanka, in the north and east, the government machinery, the state machinery is fully functional and they are fully active, and it is the civil administration which runs those manage the administration in those areas. I thought there is a requirement to clarify this point.
thank you, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you to the panellists for their comments on the presentations by the four groups. I'd just like to make some comments about military education. I know this has probably been considered in the group, but I think it's worth reiterating. I think it's actually the most powerful aspect of military soft power is the use of your education and training system. And if I can put it in the context of a receiving state or the state that offers the education opportunity and the sending state, the state that's going to use that opportunity. So in the first instance, the state offering the opportunity is offering a chance for an officer from another country or many officers from another country to go to training and be absorbed in that nation's training regime, help understand that nation's culture, military culture in particular, understand that nation's tactics, techniques and procedures. So this is something that you should look at, a willingness to reveal your own methods and procedures and your own professional military training system. From a sending state perspective, there's a value proposition that you have to consider, and that is that you're going to go to this other country. How well integrated are you going to be? Are you going to be truly exposed to the full nature of training that is being offered? And so you've got to look at it from that perspective, and I think the best opportunities are those where, certainly for the sending state, is where you're going to be absorbed. But the sending state also, like the offering state, has to see it as an investment. And by sending someone to another country to study for maybe 6 months or a year, you build networks, you build friendships, and you build understanding in that period of time, and you take that back to your home country. Alternatively, or concurrently, the offering state is doing the same. It's building networks. So ultimately, those networks serve the purpose of potentially forming a pressure valve in time of crisis if those two countries happen to come into conflict. They help if you happen to be in coalition, working for the same cause somewhere else in the globe. So these networks are vital, and the key part of those networks is actually maintaining them, maintaining an alumni, maintaining connectivity between members that have studied together and worked together in education. And the other thing about an educational environment, as an academic environment, it tends to be free-flowing and free-thinking. There aren't necessarily right and wrong answers. And some people might find that surprising, some of our civilian colleagues, that the military would think that way. But frankly, it's important for our military to be able to construct an argument, to understand an argument, and to counter an argument. You've got to be free-thinking and have good critical thinking skills to be able to do that, and that requires open and candid dialogue. So I just wanted to sort of touch on those points because that sharing of education is vitally important, and I think leads to a much deeper understanding of how each of our militaries operate, and frankly how our political military apparatus operates as well, particularly in the higher end courses like War College or Staff College courses where those things are taught. So again, thank you to the panel. I appreciate your comments as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
John?
Sir?
If you look to your right.
To my right?
Yeah. An extreme corner. Yeah. I've stopped counting how many times Joseph Nye's name has been mentioned today. It was 38 before lunch, and nobody has mentioned it after lunch. I think he's put the cat amongst the pigeons, because I think the primary role of the military is to use hard power. We mustn't forget that. And depending on each country's situation, in terms of threats and challenges, that country or that region has to adapt to it. There is a secondary role for the military, and that is in aid to civil authority. So what we are talking about essentially is that secondary role, and which is something as old as warfare itself, so it's not Joseph Nye alone. We are complicating the situation by using the word soft power. Winning hearts and minds is the function of the armed forces, or especially the army, in its secondary role when it is assisting the state. When I was here with the Indian peacekeeping forces in 87 to 90, that is precisely what we were doing. We were building playgrounds, we were repairing churches, we were repairing schools, we were providing medicine, because what we were doing is winning the hearts and minds of the local people so that you could perform your function for which you were here more effectively and more efficiently. So I think the distinction between hard power and soft power is very clear. Why the topic has come up here is because Sri Lanka is in a post-conflict situation. I'd like to suggest that Sri Lanka, for the foreseeable future, will have no military challenge or military threat. There will be no revival of the kind of terrorism that scourge this country has unfortunately faced. It is a very lucky country today, after the war. I mean, I see the transformation in this country is phenomenal. I have seen a time at the airport when the LTT in 2000 blew up the entire airport. There were suicide attacks near Taj Samudra Hotel. This country has transformed itself because its military has been able to subdue that challenge. It is now in that secondary role of assisting and taking up the challenges like aid to civil authority, humanitarian disasters and things of that sort. But officers from other countries will naturally have their own preoccupation. So may I end by saying that soft power in its classical sense is what others think about you. When I say you, your country, what is the image you are able to project? And somebody here gave the example a short while ago. If you go back to 2004 or 5 in India, there was the case of Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, a Roman Catholic. She declined to become the Prime Minister. A Muslim president, Mullah Abdul Kalam, swore in a Sikh Hindu Prime Minister. The visuals of that were absolutely stupendous. That is the kind of image, the social and the ideal, the image of the country. I think that's what social power is, and the soft power is. And I think we should make that distinction.
Thank you for your observation, General Mehta. Any other comments?
I'm Colonel Susanta Seneviratne, retired Sri Lanka Army. I think, first of all, I think we must be conceptually clear what this soft power and the hard power. If I say soft power is a part of hard power, most of the forum here we don't agree. Because soft power in simply is psychological operations. Psychological operations comes under intelligence. Intelligence operations are the military operations. In short, psychological operations and intelligence operations are birth in the military. It has come from the military operation. Here I have got the land operations on counter-revolutionary warfare, NATO pamphlet. There's a chapter on psychological operations. According to PSYOP's definition here, the definition says the planned use of propaganda or other means in support of military actions or presence designed to influence our advantage, the opinion, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of enemy, neutral, and friendly forces. So I think there is no doubt about the PSYOPs. What is going on here and everywhere is PSYOPs. Only thing that military operation does not mean that it always include weapons. It can be done even otherwise. That's the first thing that we got to conceptually clear. Second thing, let me give a fine example from Sri Lanka, how soft power had not worked the way it was. Take the last regime for an example. After the conflict came to an end, the previous regime, or I should say the previous government, did a lot, or they are the one who started rebuilding the infrastructure. They did so much of work, economically, infrastructure improvement, rehabilitation, this, that, and everything. Former president did it in a bid to win the hearts and minds of the people so that he would be able to come the next election. What happened as a result?
Okay.
The Tamil community refused that. So why? We had to inquire why. This is where soft power has failed. There is a reason. I think it must come from your, because you would understand why that reason is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for